I've learned that a really warm room means that it's more likely that you'll go to sleep. So there's no risk of sleeping this morning. If you need to do jumping jacks to avoid frostbite, feel free to do that at the back. I've been involved with fire since before it was fire, and the main relevant qualification that I have right now for this talk is I've probably created 20 to 25 implementation guides over the last 4 years. I'm also one of the committers for HL7's IG Publisher tool, and therefore have a little bit of influence about what it looks like and can explain what's going wrong at least half of the time. My objectives for you this morning is to provide a bit of background in terms of what fire implementation guides are, what they're for, what they contain. Talk a little bit about the tooling process, how we take the notion of an implementation guide and turn it into something both that your readers can look at and understand what it is that you're wanting them to implement, as well as how we produce technical artifacts that we can pass on to validation tooling, testing tools, etc., that can help ensure that the systems that are produced do what it is that you want them to actually do. We're going to look specifically at the HL7 IG publisher, what it is, where it comes from, how it's maintained, that kind of stuff. And we'll also talk briefly about Trifolia, which is a nice front-end user interface that uses HL7's IG publisher on the back end. Implementation guides are probably one of the most important parts of FIRE. The FIRE core specification is a set of building blocks. You've got a whole bunch of different resources, close to 150 of them now. There's instructions on how to use REST, how to use messaging, how to use documents, different mechanisms for sharing data. But FIRE doesn't tell you how you're actually going to interoperate with a particular partner. And different implementations are going to support different combinations of resources. They're going to support different capabilities in terms of REST. Are they read-only? Can you create? Can you assign the identifier when you do a create? All of those sort of things are up in the air. And that's intentional because different types of implementation spaces are going to need to use FIRE in different ways. We can't come up with a worldwide agreement that says everybody is going to support all of these resources, everybody is going to support all of these operations, everybody's going to use REST, nobody's going to use messaging, because that's not the way the real world works. So we have to provide lots of options, but when you want to get real interoperability happening, you're trying to constrain the options. You're trying to make sure that the options that you choose and the options that everybody that you're talking to chooses are either exactly the same or at least consistent enough that the data that you need to flow is actually going to flow. And implementation guides are FIRE's mechanism for defining those things. Implementation guides can be created at the international level. HL7 creates a number of them. Clinical genomics, there's a tutorial on that this week. Structured data capture, there's a tutorial on that this week. International patient summary, there's a tutorial on that this week. There's all sorts of implementation guides that are created by HL7. They can also be created by IHE. ISO has talked about the possibility of doing some, and any other international organization can do that. They can also be created down at the level of a particular hospital. So what does a particular department want when they see an oncology referral? And you could actually create an implementation guide that expresses that level of detail. And of course, you will have profiles created by U.S. Office of the National Coordinator, NICTIS, UK National Health Service, Canada Health Infoway, and other sort of major national organizations. And they can propagate. So you might start with something that's created at the international level, and then that gets tightened down or adopted at a national or a local level. You can also have profiles and implementation guides that are created at a local level that people look at it and say, hey, you know what? That's a really good idea. We're going to elevate that and incorporate it as part of a national standard or potentially eventually an international standard. HL7 has been doing implementation guides for quite a while. We had a mechanism for doing them in HL7 version 2. Not a whole lot of people bothered to do that because everybody was pretty happy with my version 2 looks like however I want it to look like, and the interface engines will figure out how to make the data flow, hopefully. With CDA, however, implementation guides are pretty common. Consolidated CDA actually took a whole bunch of different implementation guides and tried to drive some consistency amongst them. But they tended to be maintained in Word, published in PDF, and look kind of like that, which, as a developer who had to read that, wasn't a terribly fun experience, not necessarily intuitive. And after you've seen the word shell in bold a couple 100,000 times, your brain starts to get a little bit mushy. With Fire, we chose a different approach. We have web-based publication. You don't have to. I've been asked on more than one occasion, can you publish implementation guides for Fire in PDF? And the answer is technically yes, we can find a way to do that. Please don't. And so far, everybody who's asked, I've been able to convince of the please don't, and so haven't actually had to undertake the effort of enhancing the tools to be able to do PDF. But it's certainly possible to do that, and at some point I expect we will have no choice because somebody won't be convinced. But the general objective, of course, when you're creating a specification is you want it to be easy to understand and read for your implementers, and web-based at the moment seems to be the best way to make that happen. Fire has an interesting feature in that we use Fire to define Fire itself. So there are resources in Fire that define the data types, that define the resources, that define the codes that we are allowed to use in certain places and what collections are legitimate. There are resources in Fire that define what is the behavior of a system, so the capability statement or the conformance resource. And we take those, or a subset of those, as well as examples. Implementers really like to have examples, and we package them together, and that's what we use to define implementation guides. So rather than having to rely on MS Word and PDFs, we can use Fire XML or JSON, or if you really wanted to, I guess you could author in Fire RDF. I haven't seen anybody create an implementation guide that way, but anything's possible, I guess. And we computably define what it is that we expect systems to do. So what are the profiles, what are the constraints, and if you want to learn more about profiling, there's a number of tutorials here this week on that. What are the terminology, what are the code systems, what are the value sets, possibly what are the mappings between either the codes or the data structures and other things that implementers might already be familiar with, and then publish that as part of an implementation guide. However, it turns out that there are things that are useful to say that we don't have computable structures for. People want to provide use cases. They want to provide storyboards. They want to provide textual explanation of consent rules or security rules or general business process flows. And I suppose we could try to express all of our security rules in something like XACML, but that tends not to be super consumable by most software developers. And so we want to have free text. We want to have pretty pictures, diagrams that explain what's going on. And the way that we do that in a Fire implementation guide is either Markdown or XHTML, where we define here's what we want the web page to look like, that we can then present to the software developer and use those as well to guide them through all of our explanation of how things work. And we can create whatever kinds of content there that we want to. Implementation guides in Fire are also a resource. This is the root of the resource. It contains a whole lot of data elements, but if you're familiar with the different infrastructure resources that I showed on the previous slide, almost all of them have this same set of data elements. It's really all metadata that helps you to go and find implementation guides in a registry. So what are the identifiers? Who created it? When did they create it? Is this aimed at Canada or Japan? Is this aimed at dentistry or podiatry? All of those sorts of pieces of metadata that let you search for and find things. The interesting parts are around the edges. There's two main functions for an implementation guide. There's the portion of the implementation guide that we feed into the publication process that says what is it that the implementation guide contains and what are the parameters we want to pass on to the publisher so that it knows how to render it properly. And then we have the post-publishing portion, which is if I have an implementation guide and I want to tell a validator about it, or I want to create an implementation guide that's based on somebody else's implementation guide, what is the information that I need to know? So this structure essentially gives you a manifest of what is the data that exists in the implementation guide, so you can do things like check that hyperlinks that I'm pointing to my parent implementation guide are pointing to something that really exists, or profiles that I'm referencing in my implementation guide that are supposedly defined elsewhere in fact exist. So it's much lighter weight in terms of what exists there. Depends on is really sort of part of the pre-publishing, but I couldn't make a nice shape that sort of encapsulated that, so just pretend that that's in yellow as well. We're going to focus primarily today on the left-hand side, which is what are the resources that are part of the implementation guide, what are the pages that are part of the implementation guide. You can also have global profiles that identify what data types are or other profiles are sort of presumed, so that every place that you see patient, you assume that this particular profile holds, or every place that you see a reference, this is the profile that holds. Implementation guides aren't terribly useful if you just have the raw data. So you just have your markdown and just have your JSON files or your XML files. And what we need to do is we need to transform that source information into something that human developers can read and use and consult when they're building software. And we also need something that the tools can use. And for that, we produce, as of about a year ago, an NPM package. NPM is a technology that's used by JavaScript for library management, and we've adopted that or abused that, depending on your perspective, to be able to pass around the technical details of implementation guide packages so that tooling can go out and find them. So that when you have a validator and you're pointing at an instance, you can say, by the way, this instance should be compliant against implementation guide at such and such a URL, and the validator can then go and find the technical information it needs to perform validation. So let's talk first of all about the IG Publisher. The IG Publisher has been around for about 5 years now. It's leverages a bunch of the same code that we use to actually publish the core specification. We created our own tool suite to publish Fire when we first created Fire, because there wasn't anything else that really did what we needed it to do. And we need to, of course, to be able to consume all of our own resources for data types and structures and profiles and those sorts of things. It is open source, so you are free to contribute to it. You are free to take a copy of it. You are free to customize it if you really want to do that. I have added capabilities to it based on my own needs or my customers' needs from time to time, and we're certainly happy to have more maintainers. It is, of course, driven by that implementation guide resource, and the way that it works is it takes all of your source resources, be it profiles or code systems or graph definitions, whatever those might be, and generates what we call fragments. We have little widgets that are snippets of code inside the IG publisher that say, you know what, it'd be nice to be able to take a profile and produce a table view that gives you a hierarchical view of what are the changes between this profile and the resources it's based on. Or let's have another table view that shows you everything that you can possibly say now when you apply this profile. What are the constraints, plus what are the things that are unconstrained? Or let's give a data dictionary view that shows all of the definitions of all of the elements. Or let's produce a mapping view that just shows what are the different ways that this particular resource maps into my local database or whatever. And we can add new widgets over time that introduce new ways of presenting information to the end user. Those fragments are part of the code. If you want to create new ones, you have to embed them into the code. But we also want to have some flexibility in terms of what the implementation guide looks like. And so we use a static web generation tool called Jekyll, which is used outside of healthcare as well, that takes those fragments and takes some basic templates and says, okay, I know how to make a profile look like the way you would like to be processed, and here's all the profiles that you have, so I'm just going to iterate through and spit out all the fragments for those, and then produce pages based on the templates that you define, and spit out something that looks pretty. I'm going to show you a couple of examples of what Fire implementation guides can look like. So this is a fairly typical HL7 published implementation guide. We've got a header that tells us who created it and what the heck it is. We've got a menu that lets us navigate the specification. We have a very ugly yellow box that lets you navigate to see what are the other versions of the specification. We've got a whole whack of text that explains what the heck this project is. And then down at the bottom, we've got things like who's maintaining it, and how do you jump to the table of contents, how do you propose changes. This happens to be Creative Commons 0 because all of the HL7 international published content is. We can also jump and take a look at, provided that I can figure out where I put my mouse, the list of profiles and other artifacts created as part of this implementation guide. So there's a number of capability statements defining the different roles that exist here. So you could choose to be conformant as a form designer. There's certain things that you need to be able to do there. And there's a rendered view that says you must be able to search on questionnaire and value set and code system, and then some description in detail around those things. We also have profiles. So if you want to support an advanced rendering questionnaire, there's a summary of here's all of the extensions that we use. There's a differential table, whoops, that always annoys me, that says what are the changes. So essentially adding a whole bunch of extensions that some of them you must support, others are optional. Or a view that shows everything that's allowed in the context of this. Each one of these different views is produced by the IG publisher as a widget. There is, however, the ability to control which widgets show up, how they show up, where they show up in the page. So do you want them in tabs or do you all want them in line? We have other widgets that we chose to show in other tabs. So this is our data dictionary view. This is our mapping view. This is a widget that provides a list of all the examples. This one doesn't happen to have any, and the template isn't smart enough to know that. We could make the template smarter so that this tab only shows up if you have some. I haven't had the energy to bother to do that yet. So this is what an HL7 implementation guide looks like. This uses exactly the same publisher tool, but has a completely different look and feel because it's using a different set of templates. This one, let's see. If I go look, I need to make this a little bit smaller because I can't remember how to scroll the left-hand side. There we go. So if I go into one of the profiles here, this has a different widget. It's still got the same ones that we saw previously, the differential and snapshot, but it's got an additional widget called a grid view that highlights just the must support elements. This is not something that we expose in the core specification, but it is something that they added and wanted to display in their particular space. And this one happens to use tabs again, but of course the tab presentation is a bit different. And so you can have that kind of variability in presentation. The underlying structure of the source is identical. So you still pass in exactly the same set of profiles, the same set of example instances, the same set of capability statements, but you have control over exactly how you want the content to be rendered. And the next presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about how you take a template and use that to control the appearance. Let's jump back into the presentation. If you are interested in actually finding HL7's IG Publisher, go into the core specification, look for implementer support, and click on downloads. And if you scroll a little ways down, you'll get to a section called implementation tools. And the second implementation tool that you will find is the IG Publisher. It changes on a fairly regular basis. It changed this morning at my request for tooling that we're going to demonstrate in the next presentation. But this is freely available. You can download it and use that locally within your own environment. There's also a set of documentation on how to use the IG Publisher. So the documentation right now is really technical. Creating your own set of templates is not for the faint of heart. I've probably invested 3 person months or so worth of time in developing the different templates that I use in my projects, but we have recently moved to a design where you can create templates once and then reference them by multiple implementation guides, and furthermore you can start with a base template and then tweak it in your local space, so you don't have to create everything from scratch. You can reference some standard ones and manage the changes from that rather than having to build everything yourself. The IG Publisher in action is super boring. Let me go find a sample implementation guide. Unfortunately, Windows does not let you Control Plus, so you have no hope of reading anything. This is I could change the resolution on my screen, but that'd be not so fun for other reasons. This is my web folder. I've got a folder here that contains all of my inputs. So there's a bunch of examples. Well, not a bunch, I guess. There's images that I want to include in my implementation guide. There's a set of includes, which defines what I want to show up in my menu. There are the content for my different web pages. I've got a mixture here. Some of it is XML, some of it is Markdown. This is a demo implementation guide that you're free to download. We'll talk about it in the next session. And it basically shows you all the different kinds of things that you can do with the base framework. And then we have an XML instance and a spreadsheet instance. I should probably throw a JSON instance in here as well for some different profiles. But really all I have to do is come out to my root directory and say I want to run the generation process. That will open a command dialog. And it will chug through and read all of my source files, validate that my source files are in fact valid, that my profiles are saying things that are legal, that I'm not, for example, declaring the wrong data type for an observation value, or that I'm, okay. Excellent. I thought I had fixed this. I apparently fixed a different implementation guide. So what's happened here is that recently the current version of release 4 changed from 4.0 to 4.0.1 because we made a technical correction. And apparently I have not updated my implementation guide instance to refer to the correct version. So open up. Yes, I did. I'm not sure what's going on. Anyhow, the joy of demonstrations. If this was working properly, it would produce a set of XHTML files sitting in my output folder that I could then go and browse. Happily didn't wipe anything, so that's good. And I can see all of the content that I had defined in my implementation guide and can go browse that in my particular specification. So that is the IG Publisher. Now I wanted to quickly talk about Trifolia. Trifolia is developed and maintained by Lantana. It provides a web-based user interface for editing and managing profiles and other artifacts. For those of you who don't like hand editing XML, which is probably most of us, it also provides a registry function, so you can go and see what are all the implementation guides that have been defined in Trifolia and go take a look at what their source code is. If the maintainer of those implementation guides is comfortable with you doing that, many people are. They're happy for you to steal and reuse their content, because if you steal and reuse their content, you're more likely to comply with them, which is to their benefit. And as well, if you wanted to create a customized version of Trifolia, you're welcome to do that as well. It's web-based, which is useful in some ways. You don't have to worry about installing it on users' machines. On the other hand, if you are in planes, trains, and automobiles where internet access is slightly iffy, it can be problematic. It has some features carried over from their CDA-based Trifolia tool, but it is a completely different tool than their CDA editor. But it does integrate with VSAC, which is really important in the US and pretty much irrelevant in the rest of the world. I consider myself part of the rest of the world because I'm a Canadian. It generates all of the source necessary to kick off the IG Publisher, and it will actually run the IG Publisher inside the web environment. So you don't have to have anything local. You don't have to worry about installing Jekyll or Java on your own machine. Right now, they have support for editing 7 of the common resource types. So you can obviously create implementation guides. You can create profiles. You can manage your terminology. You can manage capability statements, which defines what systems are supposed to do. You can define operations, and you can define questionnaires. They do not yet support messaging. They do not support some of the more esoteric resources like naming system, graph definition. But they're also pretty responsive. So if you tell them, hey, I would really, really, really like this, they will be happy to talk to you, and they will generally add stuff. Sometimes takes a little bit of time to make that happen, but they're pretty good about responding to requests. On the back end, they point to a file server. You can choose what file server you're pointing to. So if you want to create all of your content in some local server rather than theirs, that is possible. They don't support all of the releases of Fire. They support STU3, and they support R4. They are currently working on supporting the current release of R5, and they're usually pretty good about keeping up as R5 evolves. They're usually not more than a month or so behind, and if you ask them nicely, they'll produce a new release just for you, because I've done that on occasion. They do provide a fairly decent amount of help documentation, and it's sort of an easier entry point for creating IG content than creating it on your own. The user interface isn't spectacular, but it's functional, and it exposes the elements that you need to be able to maintain. And most of the time, it keeps you from making silly mistakes that you could easily make if you were hand editing the XML. You can, of course, author content using a WYSIWYG Markdown editor. You can go and create your profiles. It shows you what are the elements that are available. You can tighten down and constrain those, changing cardinalities, overriding descriptions, etc. It's not necessarily as fast as hand editing XML, or even as efficient sometimes as authoring using spreadsheets, which is something else that Fire supports. Microsoft Excel is quite useful in being able to do search and replaces across content and filtering columns, etc. But it doesn't give you the same capabilities as this one does in terms of making sure that you don't mess anything up. David? Does it handle slicing? Yes. Trifolia does do slicing. I don't know how well they handle reslicing. So if you've got a base profile that slices and then you're trying to constrain things, but that's pretty advanced. But yeah, they try to support most of the things that the methodology allows, although we keep tweaking the methodology, which of course makes things interesting for all tooling implementers. That is available on the web, and I can quickly jump to an example of that as well. There we go. Yeah, so this is Trifolia. Let's go take a look at the DaVinci Ahrefs implementation guide. I can open that up. Is that at all readable to people? Sort of, almost. And go take a look at what resources are defined in that implementation guide. Okay, this is not the current version of Ahrefs, so let's not look at Ahrefs. Let's go look at something else. There we go. So they've got profiles on allergy intolerance. I can go bring that up. Supposed to be able to go bring that up. Maybe I don't have edit permit privileges on this IG, so it won't let me. It should give me a message about that. Yeah. Yeah, it's not going to let me edit. All right. At any rate, this is the tool. You can go in and upload graphics that you want to expose. You can organize your content into a hierarchical table of contents. You can define global profiles and otherwise manipulate your implementation guide using a prettier WYSIWYG user interface. Questions?
Is it reasonable to start with the Trifolia approach just to get your structure right, and then when you've got the structure, to use the standard tool after that if it's quicker?
So the question is it reasonable to use Trifolia to sort of get your framework up and running and get the base pieces defined, and then go to hand editing or whatever if it's quicker? You can actually go back and forth. So Trifolia lets you export your implementation guide, but it also lets you import. So if you wanted to author your structures using Trifolia, and then you realize, oh, I want to rename a common profile that shows up 300 different places throughout my IG, you can export, use standard text-based tools to do a search and replace, to change your profile ID or whatever across all of your source files, and then re-import it back into Trifolia to manipulate that way. The only reason that you might find yourself not needing to move away from Trifolia entirely is if you are looking at using some newer or really sophisticated profiling techniques in terms of reslicing or something like that that Trifolia just doesn't support, and where it actually loses data, which I haven't seen it do in a long time. But that would be the only reason why you might sort of need to move away entirely. I often edit using the spreadsheet approach, and there is not currently a way to convert between the spreadsheet approach and Trifolia. So that's a barrier there. But if you're sort of doing Trifolia or raw XML or JSON, then it's easy to sort of go back and forth. Any other questions on implementation guides?
What's the difference between this Trifolia versus Simplify? Is it a big?
The question is, what's the difference between Trifolia and Simplifier? Simplifier and Trifolia are similar in terms of what they can do. Simplifier does not make use of the IG publisher, so it has more limited capabilities in terms of what you want your implementation guides to render like. And they place a bigger emphasis on the registry component in terms of publishing and being able to share things in the registry. That's available in Trifolia, but not as big a feature. There's slightly differences in terms of what flavor of Markdown they use for editing. But in terms of general capabilities, Simplifier does not support the current release of Fire, so R5, and they will not support R5 until probably 4 or 5 months after release 5 actually comes out, which is not for another year and a bit. So if you are working with the latest and greatest, Simplifier won't work for you. Trifolia can. But other than that, both of them are reasonable tools for editing. There's actually a separate presentation on using Simplifier after this.
Is it possible to also generate UML class diagram views along with the XML and JSON of the profiles?
Question is, can you generate UML views of your profiles using the IG publisher? The answer is not right now. Because profiles are sets of constraints rather than class models themselves, UML doesn't really lend itself to representing them. We have experimented and tried to come up with a UML compliant way of representing what it is that we do, but turns out that most of what we do ends up being properly expressed in UML as a whole bunch of OCL, which is not so pretty to see in a diagram. And if somebody were to come to us and say, here's what it should look like, we could certainly do that. We generate UML for the base resources, because those are proper UML class diagrams. Yeah. We just haven't come up with a good way of representing the profiling and constraints in UML.
Some of the constraints you need, like fire path, are difficult to capture. But,
well, I mean, not even just
references, for example, what do you specialize in getting a bit of a view of the context of the profile? It might help.
Yeah, I mean, things like slicing, etc., just do not map terribly well into UML. Yeah.
Thanks.
Any other questions? All right, thank you.